What's up, everybody? Matt Kajeski here, back again with the Stokastic DFS channel. And today we're talking college football DFS. It is week 9 already. We have some weekday games coming up. We actually have football for 27 straight days, and I couldn't be more excited. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. We're also brought to you today by Prize Picks. You've probably heard of Prize Picks by now, but if you have not, they are a daily prop-based platform. You are literally taking overs and unders, every sport you can imagine. We're talking college football. That's my personal favorite. But you're taking over-unders and you're making lineups of those players. You can do up to 5 players where you can 10 extra entry fee. And they have a phenomenal deal for you guys. You can get 1 free month of Stokastic Plus Platinum and up to a $100 match deposit bonus when you hit the link in the video description below and make your first deposit with Prize Picks. So make sure to check them out. All right, we are here, week 9. We have a 3-game slate on a Thursday. I'm excited. I'm still green screen-less Gajeski, so let's bring you guys over to the data usage tool. In here, especially at the top, just a quick rundown. This is where you're going to find all of your game factors, seconds per play. So that's basically a pace metric, pass rates, offensive line right here. That's how many sacks they allow, defensive line, how many sacks they generate. You have your Vegas data, and then defensive statistics, how many yards they allow through the air, how many yards they allow per attempt for contextualized data, and then the same thing on the ground. So our 3-game slate kicks off with a gnarly ACC matchup. It's Virginia Tech taking on NC State. Should be a real barn burner. The total here is 39.5 points, and the spread is 13.5 in favor of NC State, which is remarkable considering their backup quarterback will be starting this game. Let's start with the Virginia Tech side. 13-point implied team total right away. That's not great, but there are some things to look at here. Grant Wells on this slate, I think he could be a contrarian option. He's averaging 205.5 passing yards per game, but he's somewhat mobile, 148 on the ground there. Not ideal volume for him either. This Virginia Tech team is 53rd in pace. They do pass 53% of the time. That's more or less a game script thing. I don't really know if they want to be passing that much, but they've been down a lot. So it's tough with Grant Wells. He's not my favorite play. We'll talk about the 2 very clear quarterbacks that you're probably getting to in cash. But for tournaments, if you're looking for pivots, it's dicey out here, but he's one of them. In the backfield, Malachi Thomas returned, and it looks like Keyshawn King might miss this game. He's really their only change of pace. They kind of phased out Jalen Holston entirely, but all this to say, Keyshawn King has a good workload, and he's somebody you can certainly look at in DFS. It's another slate where I don't really anticipate us having trouble spending the entire salary, so I'm not really worried about the price here for him. He is $7,200, but he has 15 carries, 13 carries in back-to-back games, but more importantly, his target volume is awesome. So if you come down here to the targets below, you're going to see 6 and 7 targets for him. Receiving yards, not too efficient, 28.5 per game, but now we have back-to-back games of 21 and 20 touches, mostly coming via targets, which are very, very important for DFS. So Malachi is certainly in play. Among the receivers, this is a complete nightmare to target. Nightmare. I probably just want to play Thomas and move on, but let's break it down because somebody has to do it. First thing, Stephen Gosnell hasn't played in 2 games. He's expected back here. I don't think he plays a ton, maybe 30 to 50% of the routes, but they've sort of consolidated opportunity. If not for Gosnell coming back, I would be pretty confident in Dwayne Lofton's snaps. He has an 88% and 83% route share over the last 2 games. That's pretty good for this team. He's only 3,900. I think he's the favorite to lead the team in routes. But efficiency-wise, Caleb Smith has been way better than him. 428 receiving yards to 159 for Lofton. Caleb Smith's route rate dropped to 60% for some reason. I don't know why this happened, but I think as one of these 2 players, honestly, you could maybe go to tight end Nick Gallo, who's actually second on the team in targets. His route rate is a little more consistent, but you're talking about a low upside option there. I'm really trying to focus on the top 3. Once you get below that, they use a fair amount of 12 personnel. So Daquan Wright has at least a 40% route share in 2 of the last 3 games. Jaden Blue's hovering around a 50% route share. Connor Blumrick, the former quarterback, has between 25 and 35% of the routes on a weekly basis. You even had Christian Moss pop up for 39%. So you can tell it's a pretty gnarly rotation here. Again, as far as trustworthiness goes, number 1 is Smith. That's factored into price. Number 2 for me is Lofton. Number 4 is Gallo. And if you really want to be contrarian, you could play Jaden Blue. He's just priced as if he's still with Temple. And unfortunately, he's now with Virginia Tech, and the volume is not the same. NC State. Devin Leary's out. This NC State team, before we move on there, they're 94th in pace, 51% pass rate. I thought that would drop drastically, but they just got crushed last week and they were forced into passing scripts. Jack Chambers is the QB. He's the former quarterback of Charleston Southern, who runs the triple option. So he's mobile. He already has 104 rushing yards this year. And if nothing else, you know he's going to run. Designed attempts, he had 12. He now has 19 in the last 2 games. And remember, he didn't play an entire game in his first appearance. So that's interesting to me. I think in tournaments, you could certainly play him. If he rushes in a score or 2 on a 3-game slate, that could be viable. In the backfield, I'm curious to see if we get Demi Sumo Kongbai back. He previously worked in a timeshare with Jordan Houston, but that has been essentially just the Houston show without Sumo Kongbai. The one wrinkle in this now is it's not so much a 2-man backfield. It's kind of a 3-man backfield with Chambers getting so many designed runs. So if Sumo Kongbai returns, I think you have to factor that in. Some of these season-long numbers like 16.2 touches per game for Houston, 11.2 for Sumo Kongbai, I think they could be depressed by the, addition of Chambers to the offense. So that's at least worth mentioning. But if Sumo Kongbai is out, I would have a lot more interest in Houston. Nothing really efficient or to write home about. It would just be a workload play at that point. He does have a pretty good pass game role for what it's worth. He has at least 4 targets in each of the last 3 games, so that's solid too at his price. In the receiving game, I think we get Devin Carter back here, but it's not a good passing attack in terms of volume. Efficiency is not going to be there. So how do we rank these guys? I think number 1 still is Thayer Thomas, even at his price, which is $6K. You're just going to find better options on this slate, but if you want to be like a pay up to be contrarian, you could play him. I think the wide receiver 2 might just be Daryl Jones now. He had a 90+% route rate in their last game. That was more than Keon Lesane, which was a bit of a surprise to me. But Lesane still functioned as the wide receiver 2 in terms of targets and routes, I would say. He actually led the team in targets last week under Chambers. Those would be the top 3 options. If Devin Carter returns, I think that would probably just render it more of a timeshare than bumping one of them out specifically. This team has a history of rotating receivers, and they also rotated Porter Rooks onto the field. So to kind of sum this up a little bit, Thayer Thomas should be the 1. And then I think the second best price adjusted option is Lesane or Daryl Jones. Lesane at 34 if you need him down there. Daryl Jones at 41. Again, Daryl Jones had the better routes. Lesane had the better targets, but shouldn't be efficient. You're probably not spending a lot on these guys. You're not playing them in a ton of lineups outside of tournaments. Louisiana taking on Southern Miss. I did not think this team would have this game would have a better total than the aforementioned Virginia Tech NC State game at first glance, but alas, it does. It's at 43 points. The spread is a pick'em, so a fun game to talk about here, and I think there could be some value. Louisiana Lafayette will start there. Louisiana, as they now like to be called, 64th in pace, 51.5% pass rate, mainly because of game script. They did not have Chandler Fields the last few weeks. He'll be back, but I think Ben Wildridge played well enough to keep the job. So he's tough to look at because of the timeshare on the year, but he's mobile. He's 116 rushing yards to date. And then as far as his stats go, he threw for over 300 yards, and he actually has pretty good yards per attempt metrics. The only issue is he's playing up against a good defense. I'm not sure this is the best time to target him, especially when his price has risen. And then there's always the risk they deviate back to the timeshare, which I think the only reason they stopped was injury. So that's at least worth saying. Outside consideration in tournaments. In the backfield, they do get Chris Smith back, who is the engine of their offense. He still leads the team in touches, slightly ahead of Terrence Williams, largely because of his pass game role. He was averaging 3.8 targets per game before he went down. So he's automatically the guy I would like to play. 13.2 touches per game. Efficiency is not great for him, but he's on a Louisiana offense that's kind of struggled this year. I think the pecking order is going to go Smith 1, Williams 2, Kibodi 3, and Draylon Washington 4 if he sees any time on the field. And I would prefer them in that order, with Smith 1. And then if I'm punting, it would be with Terrence Williams. But probably focusing on Smith here. Again, salary is not a huge concern. In the receiving room, Michael Jefferson leads this team with 44 targets, 387 receiving yards, only saw 2 targets in their last game, but he's still averaging 6 targets per game and 55 yards on the year. I think that's enough at 5,100 to look at. The rest of this is a complete disaster, and there is not very much, honestly, that separates a lot of these guys. I like to look at the routes for some of these teams, but this is kind of similar to a Mississippi State situation where the routes are ping-ponging all over the place. So we'll give them to you best we can, but this is a tough situation to target. So the number 2 in the year, Errol Rogers, he had been involved in about 45% of the routes till their bye, and since then he's been below 25% in the last 2. So he's tough to get to. Targets have also dropped. Neil Johnson, their tight end, has seen his routes pretty consistent, 49% for him. Peter LeBlanc has received more and more routes recently, and that actually coincides with some productivity. Only 1 target in their last game is a concern, and he's a bit more expensive than some of these min-price guys we're going to talk about. I still think he's fine. The guy who really popped off most recently has been Dante Fleming, 47 and 50% route share for Fleming. 3,400 is completely fine. He had 6 targets in their most recent game, as did Jacob Bernard. Jacob Bernard did that on a 25% route share, so I'd rather play Dante Fleming just straight up. And then from there, you have a slew of players between like 20 to 35% of the routes in John Stevens, Pierce Michael, Johnny Lumpkin. Tough to get to. If I'm playing anybody, it's 1 Jefferson, 2 Fleming, and 3 I'll probably just default back to Errol Rogers based on the target volume on the year. Southern Miss, 78th in pace, 44% run rate. They are wild with what they do on offense. When they had Ty Keys, they were semi-pass heavy. They lost him. They went to the super back offense for a game or 2. Now they've kind of balanced out, and Wilkie's their quarterback, and he has some egregious turnovers and sacks, 7 interceptions in the last 3 games. I think the engine of this offense is going to be Frank Gore, and they're going to try to keep the ball out of Wilkie's hands the best they can. Makes him a very dicey GPP option. He's only averaging 162 yards per game. However, if they're down, they're going to need to use him. So take that for what it's worth. I don't think it's worth much. Frank Gore, he got banged up in their last game. So I'm not saying he's going to miss this, but I would just get on Twitter, fire up the search engine, make sure Frank Gore is actually playing before you slot him into your lineup. I'm anticipating him playing, and he should be one of the very first guys into the lineup overall. 18.4 touches per game, hyper efficient. I think we see a lot of Frank Gore in this game if he's healthy. With him missing some time, we saw Janari Dean step up a little bit here. If you're looking for a stone min guy, Janari Dean actually has a pretty good role in their last couple of games. 9 carries and 12 carries. Nothing to write home about. Certainly not efficient, but he's the stone min. You can use that. I'd probably rather play a Lafayette receiver, to be honest, but Frank Gore for sure. In the receiving room, Ja'Karius Caston missed their most recent game. They said he was probable, which I don't know what to make of this. He's another guy I'm just watching pregame, seeing if he plays. He's the wide receiver too if he's healthy, and he's averaging 5 targets per game. He's actually pretty efficient too, 43 yards. So watch Caston. Brown Lee is the number 1 target regardless, 8.9 targets per game, 56.7 yards. He's certainly playable. Just I'm a little worried with game script, but it's going to be what it is with this team. They're volatile. That's just the way it's going to be until they get stabilized. Quarterback play, I don't think that happens even this year. But outside of him, he's the 1 for sure. The number 2, I guess the number 3, and it'll be the number 2 if Caston plays, is Tycallan Mims. 90% route share and then 100% in the last 2 games. He has target counts of 8 and 6, put up 172 yards, so it's been efficient. Tycallan Mims is actually pretty interesting for this team, I think. 3.4K. I'd rather play him than like Fleming right now, which is saying a lot. And then the wide receiver 3 without Caston is probably going to be, this is tough to predict, but I think it's Latrell Jones. His route rate's above 70% in multiple games this year, but he's non-involved in the game at all. 5 targets in the year, but like looking at his route rates, 65% last week. In their 3rd most recent game, he was at 79%. That was the game that Caston still played most of it, but I don't know. I think he's the wide receiver 3 at best when you have Caston in there. So tough to evaluate. Then tight end, Cole Cavallo is the number one. They rotate a little bit at this position. Expect to see some Luke Baker in there too, but Cole Cavallo, 3,400. I'd rather just play Mims straight up because of the efficiency. 172 yards for Mims, 72 for Cavallo, but got to mention these guys that play on the field. Real greasy game here. Good luck with it, guys. Last game, and clearly the best game, Utah-Washington State. Not just on paper, not just from, playoff perspective, conference level, but 54.5 total. So the most friendly for DFS, 7.5 point spread in favor of the Utes. 31 total easily makes them the best place to go for DFS. I think you're starting with Rising. This team is balanced enough to play him, and he's involved in the ground. He's averaging 6 yards per carry, but he's 308 rushing yards in the year. He's averaging 264 as a passer on just 31 attempts. That's solid efficiency. They're 97th in pace, and they only pass 46.6% of the time. But I think you're starting your lineups with Rising, and honestly, probably Ward on the other side if you're playing cash. The only way I'm deviating is just massive tournaments. The backfield is volatile. They've rotated guys in and out of the field. No word on Jalen Glover's status. He honestly might just be out of the rotation right now, but he hasn't received a carry in the last 2 games. He did get some snaps, so I don't think it's an injury. They've been using Tavion Thomas and Micah Bernard, and Bernard has honestly had an excellent role. 11 carries in back-to-back games, and this is their preferred pass catcher. This is the same going back to last year. They do not use Tavion Thomas as a receiver. He only has 5 targets on the year, 3 of which came in the last 2 games. But Bernard, his touch counts are excellent. Over the last couple of games, Micah Bernard has touch counts of 14 and 18. For reference, Tavion Thomas, 2 weeks ago, he had touch counts of 20, and then last week that dropped down to 9. So in the most recent game, Micah Bernard out-touched Tavion Thomas. Let's see here, 18-9. That's pretty drastic. And Bernard has the pass game role, which is solid too. I think you could play Bernard, but Tavion Thomas is going to be your GPP pivot that you're paying up for. A lot of touchdown upside with him if they're around the goal line. I think they use him still. Bernard's just a much smaller back than Tavion Thomas. In the receiving game, Utah obviously reeling from the loss of our good friend Brant Kuithe. So Dalton Kincaid has really taken over. He had a 16-target game against USC. He's now averaging 79.7 yards per game. He's averaging 8.3 targets per game over their last 4. It's an incredible role for Kincaid. He's playable. Devon Vele has an excellent role as well. He's averaging 8.8 targets per game over the last 4, 59.7 yards. So not as efficient as Kincaid, but Vele certainly playable. I'd just rather play Kincaid straight up for the price. Once you get beneath them, it's tough to play these guys at their respective prices just because it's not a pass-heavy scheme. So much of the volume is soaked up through them. So the next closest player in terms of routes run is actually going to be Jalen Dixon, 45% in their most recent game. Solomon Enos was down at 44%. So these are players that are just rotational at this point. Not sure if any of them are really playable because you have guys on the back end like Makai Cope, 19% route share. Lanier McLean, 37.5%. Money Parks, 27%. There's other players that are Thomas Yasmin didn't play in their last game, but he's involved too when he's healthy. So there's just a lot of players that this Utah team will use. I think focusing on Kincaid and Vele makes the most sense. You don't really have a strong min price play here, but I think Kincaid is still a value in terms of his price adjusted play. I'm just checking on injuries real quick, make sure there's none that I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but looks like it's just Kuithe. All right. Second half of this game, I think for the purposes of cash games, you're probably just playing Cam Ward. 31st in tempo, 63.5% pass rate. Ward had showed some mobility, but he took some sacks recently, so now he's in the negatives in terms of yards. On the ground, it's just volatile with him. He's still averaging 280 passing yards per game on 40 attempts. You can tell it has not been efficient, but volume is everything, and especially on a 3-game slate. He has the best volume on the slate, so he's pretty easy to slot in next to Rising. In the backfield, Nakia Watson's out. They've talked about using 3 backs. They're going to use Jalen Jenkins, I think, as the lead, Dylan Payne to back him up. And they've talked about involving a couple other guys. I don't think they're going to be involved more than change of pace options. So I'm honestly trying to just play Jenkins and Payne here. Of the backs, I probably won't have a lot. Then in the receiver room, they also lost, Renard Bell. Sorry. They lost Renard Bell and hasn't played in 2 games. He's out for an extended period of time. That should consolidate opportunities for your top 3 in Donovan Ollie, Dizon Stribling, and Robert Farrell. Of these players, you have Ollie and Stribling tied for yards, and then Ollie with the slight target edge. He is 50 on the year. Stribling has 4.6. However, in the last 4 games, Stribling's averaging 7.3. Ollie is at 5.5. So the roles have flipped a little bit, and their coaching staff's talked about getting Stribling more involved. I think he's your number 1 if you're playing just 1. And then, honestly, Robert Farrell's been really involved too. 7 targets per game over the last 4. He's at 339 yards, which is hyper efficient, seeing as he's about 20 targets behind Ollie and 15 behind Stribling. So really efficient for Farrell. Love playing him. And then their wide receiver 3 is actually rotated a little bit. It was Lincoln Victor to start the year, but his routes continue to plummet. And they started using Leighton Smith, one of their freshmen, 6 targets in their most recent game. He's on the field a ton. Now, this is volatile because we're talking about small samples, but an 80% route rate last week. For reference, Lincoln Victor dropped down to 15%. The routes came directly at the expense of Victor. So I think Leighton Smith is your preferred min price play on this slate. Very small sample. You're kind of betting on uncertainty here, but I think it is viable. But that'll do it for the slate. Hit the thumbs up button on your way out. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think of these plays. If there's anything I missed, or if you agree with some of my takes, disagree, would love to hear it, and we'll get back to you in the comments. Otherwise, you can reach out on Twitter if you would like. I'm available at Matt_Kajeski. All my work is there as well if you do enjoy it. Otherwise, we'll be back tomorrow talking the 2-game slate on Friday as well as the main slate on Saturday. So thank you guys. We'll see you again later, and good luck.